Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. You know that the recording is in progress. Today we have Chris Chambers, so it's a pleasure for me to introduce him. So it's really a real pleasure to introduce to you Chris Chambers. Chris is a professor at the University of Cardiff, United Kingdom. Chris is among the most active scientists working in the dissemination of open science and open science practices. Among these, Chris, you know, is the major promoter, supporter, and perhaps also the inventor. This is something that I never understood, of the registered report, a new type of publication and research format in which the author discusses the research project with the journal, the editor, and the reviewers before he or she can start collecting the data. Recently, Chris is promoting the peer community registered reports that might change even more the way we do science, on the way we will do science in the next few years. And I guess today, Chris will talk exactly about this because I saw the title of the slide. So again, a great pleasure to have you here, Chris. Great pleasure to have you back here in Italy, although virtually. And we hope to see you in person soon, as soon as this pandemic stops, or at least give us some rest. Okay.
Thanks,
please, Chris.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, it's Italy's much more fun in person. Let me just share my screen again. So we'll get this show on the road. Again, apologies for background noise on my end. It's the sound of wonderful construction work. Right. So as Massimo said, today's talk is about registered reports. And more than that, it's about taking registered reports to the next level, which I'm loosely calling Registered Reports 2.0. And this is through an initiative called the Peer Community in Registered Reports, which I'll explain throughout this talk. And hopefully there'll be plenty of time at the end for discussion also. So given the nature of this audience, I'm guessing most of you are already quite familiar with the Registered Reports format. But for those of you who are not, it's a format of research article which was developed just under 10 years ago, which aims to resolve issues with publication bias and various forms of reporting bias by splitting the peer review process into two stages. And in the first stage, which happens prior to the research being undertaken, authors submit and reviewers assess a protocol plan based upon the strength of the theory, the rationale for any hypotheses, methodological rigor, and robustness. And if this passes stage 1 review, the journal grants what we call in-principle acceptance. So the journal commits to publishing the outcomes of the research, regardless of which way they go, provided that the authors comply with their original protocol and that the conclusions are based upon the evidence presented. The authors then go away and do the research, and when they're finished, they return to the journal with a stage 2 submission, which concludes the manuscript essentially. Now it's got the results and the discussion, and reviewers now assess compliance with protocol and whether conclusions are in fact based on the evidence. So most of the heavy lifting, as it were, has been done already by this point, because the stage 1 protocol contains all of that critical review of theory, methodology, and design, and so on. Now, since we launched this format back in 2012, 2013 at Cortex, we've seen it rise steadily in the years following, to the point that we're now at over 300 journals that have adopted the format. And we've seen the format taken up across a wide range of different areas. So it began life within neuropsychology and cognitive neuroscience, which is the remit of Cortex. We then saw, in the wake of the first published registered reports, we saw more broader adoptions across STEM, political science, clinical trials, and so on, all the way through to 2020, where we've even seen the format adapted to help deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so far, it's early days, but so far the signs of the impacts are promising. We're seeing good uptake by early career researchers, with around 8 out of 10 published registered reports being first authored by a PhD student or a postdoc. So the format appears to be accessible to the ECR community. We're seeing promising signs of bias control. So stage 2 registered reports are 5 to 10 times more likely to disconfirm hypotheses than compared to regular articles. And this is probably due to a combination of eliminating bias against negative results, but also eliminating the incentive to engage in counterproductive practices such as p-hacking and post hoc hypothesizing. Alongside bias control, we're seeing benefits in terms of computational reproducibility due to perhaps more rigor and more data sharing. A key study published last year by Soderberg and team showed that registered reports tend to be rated higher in quality than regular articles across the entire board from pretty much all categories of evaluation. They outscore and outpace regular articles, whilst at the same time being cited around the same, perhaps slightly more than regular articles. So far, so good. The initiative in the first 5 to 10 years appears to be doing what we hoped it would do. However, should we be celebrating? No. The registered reports format was created as a kind of incremental step on top of the existing, in my opinion, very imperfect publishing structure that we have. And there are at least 10 limitations that we know of. And I'm going to just go through some of them now. The first and perhaps most significant limitation of the registered reports format is the stage 1 review time. This is the time that a manuscript takes during the assessment of the stage 1 manuscript, the protocol, the plan. And this can take anywhere from a matter of a month or two and up to many months if there's a lot of back and forth or the journal is particularly slow. And this naturally places a delay on research because researchers can't begin their research until they've got their in-principle acceptance. So this is obviously one of the big drawbacks of the format, that there's this necessary stage 1 review time. Now, it has been argued, and I think it can be argued, that a lot of that time spent during stage 1 is saved at the end because of benefits in terms of acceptance rates and not having to submit papers to one journal after another. However, it still remains an obstacle in the standard format. Another problem that's been identified by some researchers is that in needing to choose a journal before you begin your research, it commits authors to deciding their output journal before they know their results. And this may not be ideal because it could be that certain kinds of results are more appropriate for some journals than others, or authors want to retain that freedom to be able to make some decisions about where they put their work based on the findings. The format is also not well suited to programmatic research, where, for example, one stage 1 manuscript might produce multiple stage 2 outputs. So you can imagine in programmatic work, you could propose a large program of work over maybe several years, which has many different arms, which could be undertaken in parallel. But it's very difficult for that to go into the standard registered reports format because it would only produce one article. And so there's this need to try and think of ways of the format becoming more flexible so that one stage 1 manuscript may be able to produce multiple outputs. Across the 300 or more journals, we have inconsistent editorial standards. Some journals are more experienced at handling registered reports than others, and not all author experiences are positive. Just as we see with regular peer review, authors have good and bad experiences, reviewers have good and bad experiences. And with registered reports, we have an interesting benchmark to assess against because most of the policies that the 300 journals implement are much the same. So really any changes that we get in experiences of authors and reviewers really is down to inconsistent editing. And this can be linked to levels of training and experience, which are often quite limited amongst journal editorial boards. A fifth problem is that stage 1 manuscripts are not always publicly available. You might think that it's obvious that if a journal accepts and offers in-principle acceptance to a stage 1 manuscript, that manuscript would then become publicly registered and eventually would become publicly available so that readers could compare the completed stage 2 article with the accepted stage 1 manuscript to see if anything changed. And that's certainly ideal, but it's not the case. a review by Tom Hardwick a few years ago found that maybe only 50% of registered reports at journals make the stage 1 protocols publicly available or require that to happen. Again, it's another example of an inconsistency due to a lack of standardization across different journals and journal policies. There's also inconsistent policies on open peer review. This is something that is more of a personal opinion of mine, but I'm a big fan of open peer review, where reviews can either be signed or anonymous as reviewers prefer, but that the review is always published alongside the article. It gives more information to readers, and it also promotes a culture of accountability amongst the journal, where those decisions are no longer based on closed door black box scenarios, but are in fact ultimately accountable to the community. And of course, not all of the except registered reports formats use an open review format. We also see inconsistency in terms of open access and the availability of stage 1, 2 articles. So it always seems slightly ironic to me that any initiative designed to promote open science could end up being published behind a paywall of a publisher. And yet that's the case in some cases. Even where a stage 1 protocol may be available, we see that often the stage 2 article is behind a subscription barrier, which is completely unnecessary. There's also unclear policies on how applicable registered reports are when it comes to analyzing existing data. There's a vast, of course, amount of existing data out there, which researchers can and should be using to perform hypothesis-driven research. And many journals are just unclear how to deal with that when they see a stage 1 manuscript. They see the risk of bias, maybe if the data has been observed or not. They're not sure how to handle it. Some journals have a blanket rule against it. Others simply say nothing. But we haven't got clarity amongst the community of what's expected and what the options are. A ninth problem is that the structure of the registered report format at the moment just adds another level of pre-study evaluation on top of so many other forms of pre-study evaluation. So it risks becoming just another bureaucratic hurdle for authors. We already have to go through grant funding to get to do research. We already have to go through ethics review. If you're doing certain kinds of research, we already have to go through regulatory review. And stage 1 manuscript review is just another form of pre-study evaluation on top of that. And one of the reasons for this is that it's quite difficult for funders and journals to work together. The ideal model of a registered report in many areas is for it to act like a grant application, so that a stage 1 manuscript is assessed by a journal and a funder at exactly the same time. And then based upon this one integrated review process, authors get their research funding and their articles accepted on effectively the same day. However, this is difficult to organize. And this is something that a barrier we've encountered over the last few years due to legal constraints, particularly within the European Union, that restrict cooperation between public funders, particularly government funders, and corporate publishers. And it's an example of how the reliance of the scientific community on the corporate publishing system stands in the way of making our science more robust. And which leads me to my final problem with the format as it exists now. And this is a general point also about publishing in general, that too much power at the moment resides, in my opinion, with journals and by and large, the corporate publishers to decide which registered reports are accepted, which go into the scientific record. Whereas really all of that power should lie with authors in the broader scientific community. These are the problems. And this is why we created the peer community in registered reports as a tool for solving some of those, if not all of them. So PCI registered reports, or PCI-RR, is a platform we created last year for reviewing and recommending preprints. So registered report preprints across all areas of research, including STEM, medicine and health, social sciences, and the humanities. It's free, it's non-commercial, and it's not a journal. It doesn't publish articles. What it does is it reviews preprints. And once this review process is complete at stage 1 or stage 2, the submission is recommended. And what happens then is that the revised manuscript is posted on a preprint server where it's hosted, and the reviews and the recommendations are published on the PCI-RR website. And then, to make this attractive to the community, authors have the option to take their recommended peer-reviewed preprint and publish it in a traditional journal if they wish. And we have a growing list of what we call PCI registered reports friendly journals, which commit to accepting the recommendations of PCI registered reports without further peer review. And this is really key. So they've agreed that our peer review process that we manage replaces their peer review process that they would conduct themselves. And of course, that means that the format's quite attractive because it puts power back in the author's hands. So the way this works from a technical point of view is that at stage one, you submit your registered report to PCI-RR as either a private or a public URL to a file in a repository. Excuse me. This is then triaged, and if it passes desk, then it's peer reviewed, where through the process of peer review, it's revised and updated. Now, the preprint doesn't need to be public at this point. It can be posted as a view-only OSF link, for example, so it can be kept private where authors wish to maintain, some confidentiality over the content of their stage one manuscript. But then at the end of the stage one process, if it all goes well, the registered report is recommended and achieves in-principle acceptance, or IPA. And at this point, we have our PCI registered reports friendly journals, all of them that are within remit, automatically offer IPA as well. And the authors go away and do the research. When they finish, they come back, deposit an updated preprint on a preprint server. This time it's public. And they then go through the stage 2 review process where the preprint is revised. And eventually, if it all goes well, meets the criteria at stage 2, is recommended. And this produces a valid, citable final preprint on the preprint server with its own DOI, and that, authors can stop there if they want. Completely free, completely fully open access publication that's been rigorously peer reviewed and contains all of the science and all of the quality evaluation criteria. But also, of course, we recognize the need for scientists to have their work provided with the badge of a publisher in a journal. Therefore, they also have the option to submit to a PCI registered reports friendly journal, where it will be published without further peer review. So basically just straight away accepted. Or of course, they can publish in any other journal that wishes to accept the article as well. They're not restricted in any way. So we have currently 24 PCI registered reports friendly journals. And this list is growing all of the time. There are a lot of benefits to journals signing up to this initiative because the editors of the journals can become recommenders at PCI registered reports. So they can become part of this active community, this really dynamic, growing community that has a lot of expertise in editing registered reports across different areas. And in return, the editors of those journals gain the ability to help shape the scientific record beyond the boundaries of their particular journal. In many ways, I think of, and this is slightly kind of ironic from where I'm talking from, but I find that the PCI Registered Reports Initiative a little bit like setting up the EU, in the sense that each journal that buys into it as PCI friendly is trading some of the sovereignty they have over in their own country in exchange for pooling that sovereignty across many different journals, and thereby helping to bring the community on board together in shaping the scientific record. And we have 24 of these journals currently joining, and there's many more in the pipeline, and you can see some of them listed here. And there's also a category of PCI registered reports interested journals, which don't go all the way to committing to endorse our recommendations without further peer review, but they are very interested in submissions, and they gain access to an advanced list, and they will often make offers to authors who have got acceptance because they might decide they really like this paper, or they really think the reviews were rigorous or whatnot. So the key point to make here is that PCI-RR friendly journals commit to accepting our recommendations without further peer review. And so what that does is it gives authors the ability to decide which, if any of these journals, gets to publish their stage 2 registered report. It completely turns the table on the entire system so that authors are now back in control. There are some other unique features of PCI registered reports that we've built in to try and tackle some of those problems that I mentioned at the outset. First is the programmatic registered report format. This is a new type of registered report that doesn't exist anywhere else, in which one stage 1 manuscript can lead to multiple stage 2 outputs. And what this means is that if you've got a program of work in mind that might take a number of years, in which there's too much for one paper, or there's multiple research questions, or you simply want to split it up in some way, then you can submit and have reviewed and accepted one integrated stage 1 manuscript, which then once you get IPA, automatically grants IPA to all of the stage 2 outputs that you plan to submit based upon that stage 1 protocol. So the idea is to make the process much more efficient. Secondly, to address the problem of stage 1 review time, we've introduced a type of review called scheduled review. So typically with standard review, shown here in panel A, authors prepare a manuscript completely, and then they submit it to PCI registered reports or to the journal, where it goes through a triage process. The editor or recommender acquires the reviewers, and then there's a process during which it's under stage 1 review, and then there's finally a decision at the end. It's a very serial process, it's very linear, and it's very slow. So much of that time is chewed up in recommenders or editors finding reviewers, reviewers being late, etc., etc. There's all of this time, this kind of wasted time in there. So what we've tried to do is parallelize a lot of the review process by having authors prepare what we call a registered report snapshot. Before they even begin writing their full manuscript, they write a 1-pager, which summarizes the broad strokes of the proposed plan. This then is submitted to PCI registered reports, where based upon that snapshot, we line up the reviewers for a date in the future. And that might be, say, 6 weeks or 8 weeks ahead of time. And during that time, the authors are writing the manuscript, getting it ready for the deadline ahead. And then, because the reviewers have been booked in advance, and we're keeping in communication with them throughout the entire time to make sure there's no delays, the manuscript is submitted, and if all goes well, the review process really takes only a matter of days compared to weeks or months. So the idea here is to greatly accelerate this period of stage 1 review so that we can make the format much more attractive, particularly to early career researchers who may be on short-term contracts. And here's an example of how the template that we use to promote the registered report snapshot. So what the authors basically take this template and fill in the blanks, and then they upload that to PCI-RR. To try and improve standards and to raise the level of quality of the editing that goes on, and we've also introduced an entrance exam for recommenders who want to join PCI-RR. Basically, this is a test that takes about 2 hours, and any recommender who will end up making a decision on a manuscript of PCI registered reports must score 95% correct on this test. It includes basic knowledge of the registered reports format, whilst also testing knowledge of core policies of the PCI initiative. And also it has a number of scenarios in there and asks the recommender to explain how they would deal with that. And then the way they approach that is then assessed. So the idea here is to, again, generate more knowledge, help to train the editorial community to do a good job at handling this format. Now, I want to given the nature of this audience, I want to give a constructive example of how you could use PCI registered reports as a PhD student or an early career postdoc. And let's say you want to, the aim here is to publish a series of independent registered reports as part of your work. But you don't want to go through journals one by one, and you don't want to submit multiple stage 1 registered reports. So what you can do, particularly if you're on a tight time frame, is you begin by designing the registered reports that you have in mind and designing the research. And then once you've completed that sort of intellectual process with your team, you submit a stage 1 snapshot, which is to PCI registered reports. And you can post this. This could be a programmatic snapshot. So it's got multiple questions, multiple hypotheses, multiple methods, perhaps. You can post this on the OSF, either publicly or under a private embargo. You submit that snapshot URL to PCI-RR using the scheduled review track. You then choose a future date for review, for example, 6 weeks ahead. This is before you've started writing the manuscript. And once you've passed the recommended triage and the manuscript is lined up to go into in-depth review, you start working on your full programmatic registered report manuscript. And whilst you're doing this, while you're designing and writing that stage 1 registered report, you're consulting along with on the side the list of the PCI registered reports friendly journals to ensure that, if there are any additional requirements for particular target journals you have in mind, then you meet those requirements. So some of the target journals, for instance, set a higher bar on statistical power than PCI registered reports does. or they might require more strict bias control if you're dealing with existing data than PCI registered reports does. And we list all of these additional criteria on the website so that you can see if you do want to publish in, say, Cortex or PLOS Biology, whatever it might be, whatever the target journal you have in mind might be, then you can meet those requirements. Then when you're finished, you submit your full stage 1 manuscript by the due date that's been set. And then because review is planned in advance, you get your reviews and you'll get your first recommendation, your interim recommendation, within about a week or two after submitting. And then you go through the regular revision process. And if eventually that goes well and you gain in principle acceptance or IPA, PCI registered reports will then tell you which journals amongst the list of PCI-RR friendly journals are eligible outlets and will endorse that decision automatically. So you don't have to submit to these journals. You don't have to submit anything to them at stage 1. They automatically endorse the decision because they outsource that decision to us. And this is what I like to think of as actually insourcing. So it's really the scientific community taking back control of this process from publishers. And you can also ask for a provisional steer from PCI-RR about which journals might be eligible if that's something of concern. Now you've got your IPA in hand for your programmatic registered report. Basically, you've got an approved program of multiple stage 2 RRs accepted in advance, which you can then choose to publish in any of the eligible PCI-RR friendly journals. So if you're working in cognitive neuroscience, you'll have Royal Society Open Science, Cortex, Brain and Neuroscience Advances, and so on, or all of these journals to choose from. And you can just choose when the time comes where you want them to go. So you could say, all right, I want to go to Cortex with this one. I want to go to RSOS with that one, etc. Or this particular one, I don't want to send to any of those. I'd like to have a crack at a different journal altogether. So you can choose what you want to do with them. But the main point is you've got that insurance policy where you won't have to go through peer review outside the PCI-RR process. Do your research, publish each stage 2 output as you progress, and in the journal of your choice. So you can see here that through one integrated review process at the beginning, you can get accepted in advance a program of work that can go to multiple journals, all as rigorously reviewed registered reports. Now, before I wrap up and we move on to discussion, I'd just like to show you in a more kind of concrete way what some of the benefits of doing this are for you and also for the community around us. So in each of these is a different kind of benefit that you can get in theory from peer review and publishing. Now, a regular non-registered report at a traditional journal is, in my opinion, kind of like the lowest level. It's like the baseline. It's the status quo, where really none of these benefits like pre-study, peer review, IPA, scheduled review, etc., is really available. If you use registered reports at a traditional journal, i.e. if you submit to a journal, which you can easily do, then you gain the 2 core benefits of registered reports, which is pre-study, peer review, and in-principle acceptance before results are known. So you certainly gain those benefits, but you don't get programmatic registered reports. You won't benefit from scheduled review, so the stage 1 review process can take longer. You won't know how much training or experience the editor has necessarily had in handling your registered report, and you won't be having peer review undertaken independently of a journal, which means you're stuck within that particular journal's infrastructure, and it's often very difficult to port reviews from one journal to another. And so that means a lot of these other benefits, like having the power to decide your journal destination, or having the ability to choose a journal after stage 2, etc., or open peer review, these are rare or inconsistent. All of these benefits you get from PCI registered reports. So you've got all of the standard benefits of registered reports, whilst also having a lot more control over the fate of your work, and also ensuring that what you produce, and the very last one down here, is free to read for authors. So it's free to the scientific community. Because remember, no matter what gets published in the journal, the peer-reviewed preprint that is the essence of the science that you're doing is freely and publicly available forever on the preprint server associated with a DOI. So this automatically meets all open access requirements. It's posted and published prior to signing any copyright agreements or anything like that. So no one can take it down. The publisher has no control over it. And it, again, puts you in control, ensuring that your work benefits from being as open and as rigorous as possible. Before I finish, just a few links. to find out more about this. So we've got our guide for authors here on the PCI Registered Reports page, which goes through all of our policies in detail. And there's some general information here also, which can be useful for introducing people around you to the initiative for the first time. So it provides a kind of broad stroke summary of the initiative. There's also a list of frequently asked questions. And if you're a journal editor or you know someone who is, and you would like to convince them to become, for instance, a PCI Registered Reports friendly journal, we've also got detailed information for adopting journals where we answer a lot of questions from editors. We explain in detail the process of joining PCI-RR as a journal and the benefits for both the journal and for the community. And the initiative is proving to be very popular. We're getting about at least one submission a week at the moment, and growing. We've had a few stage 1 IPAs already accepted. So as I hoped and expected, the benefits of this initiative are coming through, and we're seeing a really good uptake amongst researchers in different fields. So I hope that continues. These slides are available here on the ISF if you want to download them and use them yourself. They're all CC0, so they're free to use. But that's really the main point I wanted to discuss. I just wanted to show you what's coming up in the future. So, most talks that you'll hear on registered reports will be very much locked within the old way of doing things through standard publishers, journal-based review. There's simply no need for any of that stuff. All of the review process is undertaken by the scientific community. It's just been co-opted by publishers. We don't need publishers. We don't need publishers to review our science. We don't need them to coordinate the review process. We don't need them to provide the quality badge of approval. We can do all of that stuff ourselves. And this is hopefully the first step in that direction. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully there's some time to have discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. It was really a very, very interesting presentation full of useful information. As I've written already in the chat, please, if you have any questions, write them in the chat, following the instructions that are there, and I'll begin reading them aloud now. The first question is, how are the PCI-RR reviewers recruited?
So good question. So in terms of reviewers, they're recruited the same way editors recruit reviewers at journals. So they're recruited based on field expertise, statistical expertise, if that's relevant, any of the usual criteria that an editor will use to select a peer reviewer is the same at PCI Registered Reports. And the important point to remember here is all of the recommenders that we have, and particularly the managing board, are very experienced editors. There's nothing different about this compared to what you get at a journal, except the process. We're changing the process. We're porting it outside the world of corporate publishing and taking control of it. But it's essentially the same community doing the same job in the same way, but according to, of course, strict criteria. So there's no need to be, for instance, concerned about review quality. If it, however, that question was about recommenders rather than reviewers, because I know sometimes these terms can get a little bit mixed up. The recommenders at PCI Registered Reports act basically as editors would, or associate editors would of a journal. They're selected based upon equality and diversity considerations. So we have a mission at PCI Registered Reports to try and make the world of journal editing more open and accessible and more reflective of the true balance of science and demographics in science. So there's a focus on the global South and on minoritized, groups. And also, of course, expertise is crucial. So we look for people who would qualify to become an associate editor at a respected journal. And of course, as I said, in order to become a recommender, you have to pass this entrance exam.
Okay, another question. Is there a way for reviewers to have their reviewing activity recorded so that it is accountable to research evaluation units? Something like Publons, which is a commercial service, so I'm not interested, but embedded into the platform?
So, you don't need this because all of the reviews are published, right? So if you wish to create a record of your reviewing activity, you can, of course, submit anything you want to Publons or any other service that's available. But you've also got to remember, if you sign your review will be posted. So all of the reviews are made public at every stage of the process. And you choose whether to sign it or not. So if you want to create your own public record for your own benefit, then you can do that just within the existing infrastructure. There's nothing also stopping you taking that and posting your reviews in any other service that's provided. And to ensure accountability for PCI itself, that's why we have the open review process applying regardless. So reviewers can choose to review anonymously, but the reviews will always be available to the community.
Another question is, how can a person become an endorser or a reviewer?
So you can just sign up on the website. So you can apply to become, you can just join and ask to become a reviewer. If you meet the criteria, then recommenders will likely invite you to review a manuscript when it falls within your field of expertise, just as they would as a journal editor. But you don't have to have joined PCI registered reports to review manuscripts. It's just the same as the review process at a journal. Anyone can be invited who meets the requirements. To become a recommender is also a process of applying. Karina Logan, my colleague, oversees the recruitment of recommenders, and that's also straightforward. As I say, you just express interest. There's an assessment that's done by the panel, the managing board, to look at levels of expertise and track record and so on, and EDI requirements. And then if you pass that stage, then you just do the entrance test, and then you're signed up and you can start recommending.
Another question, is there any chance for blockchain technology to enter your process? Would be of interest to electronically certify approved PCI stages to make them even more valuable?
I don't see any barrier to this in the future, but I also don't see it as something that's necessary now. I've often looked at blockchain as being a kind of solution, looking for a problem. Particularly in the context of registered reports. It's been suggested before that blockchain could be useful for validating particularly the timestamps on stage 1 protocols. But I actually think this is kind of overkill. It's not something we need at the moment. Regular timestamps produced by the OSF registration process provide sufficient evidence of timestamps. I think if the format was to scale up and out into the future, into areas where blockchain is more common and more popular, then I certainly see no reason why it couldn't be used. It's not something that we've prioritized at the moment, though.
Thank you. In your PCIRR friendly journals, I don't see the new peer community journal. Why is the question?
Which journal?
It's
oh, the peer community journal. No, it's there. It's definitely there. Hang on a minute. Let me share my screen, and I'll see if I can find it. It's possible I was using an old version of my slides, but I don't think so. Hang on. Hopefully, you can see my screen again. And if we scroll up here, here it is. Peer community. Hopefully, you can see what I'm pointing at here. Peer community journal is there. So, peer community journal, for those who are unfamiliar, peer community journal is the PCI journal. It's recently established. And this is one journal which will publish your accepted stage 2 registered report without any constraints whatsoever, without any conditions needing to be met, except for it being accepted by PCI registered reports. A lot of the other journals have additional requirements, like in terms of we need 90% statistical power, or this or that and the other. And all of those conditions are listed on the website. And are often met, because that's often the way registered reports go. They're often more rigorous anyway. But with PCJ, the Peer Community Journal, it will accept anything which meets the already rigorous standards of PCI registered reports itself.
Then another question, any specific reason why PCI is currently limited to RR?
It's not. In fact, it's one thing I didn't mention is that PCI is, and let me just see if I can show you this. PCI registered reports is just one of the children of the broader PCI initiative, which, let me just bring up the entire website here. And then I'll share my screen again. Share screen, share the whole screen. And share my whole desktop. So can you see this? So
yes.
So PCI is a broad initiative which has multiple networks in it. I think there's at least 14 PCIs at the moment. They all work basically the same way. So they all involve the peer review of preprints. None of them are journals. They all review preprints. They all issue recommendations. And most of them are disciplinary in scope. So you can think of them as like horizontal layers in science and research. So evolutionary biology, ecology, paleo, etc. PCI registered reports is the only initiative which is cutting vertically through all of them. It's like a column cutting through all of them, because PCI registered reports isn't built around a particular field. It's applicable to all fields, but only for a particular format of research, i.e. the registered reports type of research. But there are multiple PCIs in different areas, and they have various different agreements with journals also, so they're certainly worth considering. You can find that at the peercommunityin.org webpage.
Okay, then there is a question by Maria Bortoletto, which is that is quite long. I don't know if Maria wants to ask this herself, or should I read it? Maria? I don't hear, so I'm reading.
Like I can answer the question already. So
okay.
So it's a good question. So, you know, this is often the case with a new initiative. So there are often concerns, and I understand them completely from early career researchers, about the need to meet traditional criteria, usually decided by old people like me, about what counts as high quality research. You know, journals with certain impact factors. And I know, for example, in Italy, there's a lot of obsession over the impact factor as well. And this comes into play with our valuation criteria. So one of the points to make, and so just to make my position on this clear, I think all of that is wrong, and I don't think we should be taking into account impact factors. However, that is a should argument, and they don't matter. What I think doesn't necessarily matter. What matters is reality, and the reality is that people do care about these issues, and this is why the journals that you will see on our PCI-RR list are respectable journals like Cortex, like Royal Society Open Science. And you'll see on our PCI registered reports interested lists, journals like Nature Human Behavior, PLOS Biology, journals which are, you know, undeniably attractive to everybody. So you shouldn't look, when you look at the list of PCI registered reports friendly journals, yes, you may see journals on there that you wouldn't publish in if you need to meet certain impact factor criteria, like for example, PeerJ. They're on there because they share the ethos and they're welcome, and we don't believe the name of the journal carries any weight when it comes to PCI registered reports, because all of the evaluation is done by us, the community. It's simply a badge at the end or a label. It just gets indexed into the scientific literature. Do I think that this particular aspect has an impact on the initiative? Yes, of course. I mean, what we're trying to do always is we're trying to innovate things and make them better for everybody. You have to do that from a base where you're starting with reality. You're starting with a publishing infrastructure and an incentive structure, which is not optimal, which values meaningless things like the impact factor. But you've got to build on that, and you've got to build away from it gradually. So what we've tried to do with PCI registered reports is those two things. We've tried to bring in journals that are respected and valued members of the journal world into our PCI-RR friendly list. And we have enough of them, and they're growing all the time, and they will continue to grow really rapidly this year and in future years. So that's one thing. But the second thing is we're also taking control of the review process ourselves. We're taking it away from journals. There's no reason why, if you think about how does a journal get a high impact factor? It maintains some kind of sense of mystery and prestige over the magical review process that it coordinates, which is done by exactly the same community as the next journal with a lower impact factor. It's a complete lie that's being told to the scientific community. And only by puncturing this lie can we break the stranglehold of these ranking systems and impact factors. And we do that by taking back control of the review process from the publishers in the first place, making it transparent, and showing these journals what they really are, which is simply ways of voluming the literature. They're not contributing publishers, in my opinion, are not contributing anything of value that we couldn't do ourselves. So hopefully there's enough benefits in there still for it to be a popular initiative. And it's building on this increment, these incremental changes relative to the current system. But there also is a vision to try and use this as a lever to kind of bulldoze all of this obsession with impact factor and rank in the long term.
Thank you. I've been able to unmute myself now, so thank you for the response.
You're welcome.
Okay, then there is another question that was asked during your talk, and you have partly, I think, also already answered it. But anyway, I don't know if you want to add some information on this. The question is whether sorry, oh, I've lost it. Just 1 second. Okay, if it is, if registered reports are available for all areas of science and where to find information about this.
Yes, they are. So the short answer is yes, they're available in any field where qualitative or quantitative research is undertaken. And in fact, one of the things I'm particularly pleased about is that by opening it up this wide, we're seeing submissions coming from areas that we've never seen before, particularly qualitative research. There's a real problem in qualitative research with bias and with certain kinds of outcomes being prioritized in qualitative journals. And we're finding really good traction, for instance, in that area. I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago at an archaeology conference where the initiative was seen as very attractive for eliminating various forms of bias in that area. We open it as wide as possible, and then we aim to recruit the experts we need in new areas to deal with submissions and to ensure high quality peer review. And you can find all of that information just on the general PCI pages and in the guide for authors. But essentially, if you're doing research involving quantitative data analysis or qualitative evaluation of evidence, then you can use PCI registered reports.
Okay, then I want to remember to everybody that if you want to make a question, please write it in the chat. Otherwise, we won't be able to track it. Maybe there was some hand raised by, I don't find it anymore. 1 second. Maybe Valeria Tarmati wants to ask a question. Valeria, do you want to ask?
I think she said it was, she raised her hand by mistake.
Ah, okay.
I asked her.
Okay.
She answered just now.
So, thank you. So are there any other questions? No, it seems, yes. Suppose that PCI takes over. What would be the advantage for journals to follow the PCI rules?
So I'm not entirely sure what you mean, but I'll have a go at answering this. You tell me if I'm off base. So if what you mean is why would a journal follow the PCI registered reports policy requirements? So for example, we have in-depth stage 1 and stage 2 criteria for evaluating manuscripts. And there are a lot of benefits for journals and journal editors to get involved. So as I said, it expands the horizon of the journal. So now you've got the editors of that journal no longer deciding what happens in their little kind of enclave of their journal, but having a role in evaluating science beyond and out with journals altogether, and then leaving it up to authors to decide which journal gets their paper in the end. So it's pooling together expertise. And I found that this is something that's particularly attractive to journals and editors in the context of registered reports, because they're a relatively new initiative, and a lot of editors are interested in them, but don't feel they necessarily have the expertise to always handle them properly, which I think is a really good sign that that we need to come together. And so we have editors joining from who've never handled a registered report. They work very closely with the managing board, who have a lot of experience in editing registered reports, like me and Zoltan and others. And we work very closely with the new recommenders to ensure that they're learning as they go, and we're consulting the whole time. So there's a lot of benefits for journals in terms of pooling expertise and becoming part of a broader community, without having to give up their editorial roles at the journal. They can maintain that. They can maintain a direct path for registered reports at their journal if they wish to keep offering one. There's no problem there. The benefits for the publishers are more financial in the short term. Publisher gets to publish a high quality submission without having to coordinate the review process. So they're getting something for nothing. Of course, in the long run, our aim is to take control of the review process so that publishers can no longer claim that managing peer review is an added value. It's not an added value. It's a value that we already provide for nothing. And therefore, it makes no sense to be donating it to the profits of the publishing industry, in my view. But there are sufficient benefits already for them in the short term, and there are sufficient benefits for journal editors to come in to become part of the community.
Thank you. Well, I think that this was a fantastic presentation. You gave us a lot of very useful information. I think we probably need also some time to digest it all. And in the chat, yeah, I'm saying it for everybody in the chat, there is the link to the slides. And if you have, does anybody have any other question? No, in this case, well, thank you a lot again, Chris. It was really very interesting. And I want to remember to everybody, the people who have not done it yet, to join us at itrn.org. And the next talk will be in a month. And yeah, that's it for today. And thank you again.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. And please contact me if you have any questions. All my details are in the slides.